Why is this alarming? Why is this alarming to us? Because this tells us that if you have poisonous rhetoric, even if you have a peace-loving nation, even if you have a nation that respects others, you will radicalize this nation. Because poisonous rhetoric, if you keep hearing it for a month, 2 months, 5 months, for an entire year, and someone who claims to have authority, someone who could potentially be a president, this is very dangerous. It ruins the social fabric of our society, the religious fabric, the racial fabric. This is why it's very alarming. And the past year or so, we have seen the most hateful rhetoric from someone like Donald Trump about immigrants, about African Americans, and especially about Muslims and the religion of Islam. You know, Donald Trump, he's not really an Islamophobe. If you look at his history, you don't find anything significant in his history against the religion of Islam. Donald Trump is an opportunist. He's using this hateful rhetoric in order to solicit more voters, in order to create zealots, to have the highest number of Americans supporting him. That's what it's about. Otherwise, if you look at his history, he doesn't really care about the religion of Islam. He really doesn't care about Muslims. But once he realized that if you stir hate and anger, then there are people who will be impacted by this fear. And they'll vote for you. They'll give you their support. And this is extremely dangerous. That's why he uses these tactics. He knows what he's doing. Donald Trump uses tactics primarily to cater to 2 types of groups. You know the tactics that he uses? He creates this enemy, Muslims, immigrants. He focuses on humiliation. We Americans are being humiliated by these terrorists, by China, by Japan, by whoever it is, by Mexico. And you know what? This actually has an impact on many Americans. They feel humiliated when they hear such rhetoric. So he creates anger, he creates fear, he creates this feeling of humiliation. And this pushes so many people. So he's trying to cater to 2 groups. The first one is traditional white Christian males. He wants their support. And he's tapping into their deeply rooted racial and religious bias. Because he wants their support. You know, since the 1960s, this group of people, they lost a lot of their prestige, a lot of their power. And they're not happy with that. They miss those good old days when they could openly boast about being the best of the people, about degrading others, openly attacking other races. Some of them miss those days. And so he's trying to gain support in this particular group. So he uses this rhetoric in order to arouse them. This is one group. The second group, which is very dangerous, is white supremacists. You know, groups like the KKK and others. He's trying to mobilize them. And you know, since decades, he's given them the biggest boost in membership. The biggest boost in membership. Every single day, they're recruiting thousands of people. Because of this hateful rhetoric. Because of what he's doing to this society. They're gaining more and more members, and they love what he's doing, especially when he speaks with authority and he wants to teach the whole world a lesson, and all races he wants to teach them a lesson. They love that. You know, the Pharaoh used the same techniques. He spoke with so much authority, so much power. Ana rabbukum al-a'la, I'm even your Lord. That's what he declared. And the Egyptians, they just submitted to that power. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warns everyone in the Holy Quran. Tilka darul akhirah. Allah says that dar al-akhirah, the afterlife, is for who? It's for who? لِلَّذِينَ لَا يُرِيدُونَ عُلُوًّا فِي الْأَرْضِ وَلَا فَسَادًا. is for those who do not want to be arrogant in this life and act so powerful. Allah has assigned the akhirah for those who do work. They may rise to power, but with humbleness. Their goal is not just to achieve power. So we see that he is using fear and anger and hatred in order to gain support from these two groups. And this is very alarming because he's really creating hate and fear. You know, back in March, there was an interview conducted with him. And you know what he said? Many of you may remember this. He said, I believe that Islam hates us. You know what this does when millions of Americans hear this from someone who has some sort of authority because he's a candidate? He said, I believe that Islam hates us. Now I have to say something here. What do you mean, Mr. Trump, by us? If by us you mean racism, then yes, you're right. Islam hates racism. If by that you mean sexism, then yes, Islam is against that. If by us you mean when you mocked that disabled person, that reporter with a disability, then yes, Islam hates that. If by that you mean hatred and racism and egotism, then yes, Islam hates that. But you see the fear that he's creating. Many people are really afraid of the religion of Islam when they hear such hateful rhetoric. And they have no clue what Islam is, what extremism is, what Muslims are. Just like the Sharia issue that we had a few years ago. Remember when everyone was talking about Sharia law creeping into our societies like this spider in our societies? Many of you heard that, right? But most of those people who were pushing for anti-Sharia legislation, they had no clue what Sharia law is. I remember one time this state senator from Alabama, he was pushing for anti-Sharia legislation. And you know, he was very fervent about it. A reporter asked him, can you explain to us what Sharia is? You know what he said? He's like, I don't have my file in front of me right now. Has no clue. Has no clue what Sharia is, yet he's pushing for anti-Sharia legislation. You know, many of you may remember the interview with my respected father and Pastor Terry Jones. When my father asked him, why did you come here to burn the Quran? What brought you here? What did he say? He said, I have come to protest Sharia. Sharia is no good. I burned the Quran to show my rejection of Sharia. My father asked him, what is it about Sharia that you don't like? What is it about it? He's like, Sharia is very violent. My father asked him, give me an example. What is it about Sharia that you don't like? Remember what he said? He's like, yeah, because I burned the Quran, because the Sharia and the Quran tells Muslims to stone the one who has committed adultery. My father told him, you know, if that's why you burned the Quran, that's not mentioned in the Quran. It's mentioned in the Bible. The Bible is actually the book that speaks of stoning the adulterer. And 16 others, by the way. The Bible prescribes stoning to death or the capital punishment to 16 offenders. One of them is a rebellious child. Thank God you're not living in that era, because we have some rebellious kids in our communities. But the Bible does speak about that, by the way. A rebellious son who doesn't stop his rebellion is to be stoned to death at the gates of the city so everyone can see it. That's the Bible. Many of them are ignorant. What's going on? What is the religion of Islam? They have no clue. But it's this fear that he's creating, and he's actually lying to many Americans. What's amazing to me is that I've never seen this anywhere, really. Someone who can openly come out and lie to millions of people and just get away with it, and people are cool about that. This is extremely dangerous. You know, he claimed to see thousands of Muslims celebrating on 9/11 when those twin towers came down in New Jersey. And when they kept asking him, you know, there's no such thing, there's no such footage, he kept insisting, no, I saw it with my own eyes. I saw thousands of these Muslims celebrating that day. But you know what? Millions of Americans are actually buying these lies. And it's really impacting them. Now, let's look at these statistics. Because one of the points that he is using, and those Islamophobes are using, is that the biggest threat today to American society is what? Muslim terrorism. Or they call it Islamic terrorism. We don't have Islamic terrorism. Yes, there are so-called Muslims who commit acts of terror. But we don't have something called Islamic terrorism. The religion of Islam is a peaceful religion. If you remember the Republican primaries and the debates, it seemed as if the biggest threat to America was Islamic terrorism. These Muslims, they're destroying our society. They're going to kill all of us. And many Americans are actually believing that the biggest threat facing their society today is Muslim extremism. But let's look at the facts. I want you to know these facts so you can share these facts with your society. And this is not to downplay extremism and terrorism committed by so-called Muslims. Terrorism is a grave sin. It's a grave crime. But is it really the biggest threat that we're facing in our society? Look at these statistics. Here in the United States, from 2005 till 2010, how many Americans in the US were killed by Muslim terrorists? How many do you think? The way Trump talks about it, you would think 240,000, right? The way he's presenting it to the people. Because that's the biggest threat. How many? According to official statistics, from 2005 till early 2015, 24 Americans died. 24. And yes, this is a huge crime. Because every life is sacred. But is this really the biggest threat facing America? In a decade, 24 Americans dying because of extremist Muslims who committed acts of terrorism. In this same period, brothers and sisters, in this same decade, over 300,000 Americans were killed because of gun violence. You know, even the Washington Post reported that in the year 2013, there were more Americans killed by toddlers, little kids with guns, than by Muslim extremists and terrorists. You're more likely to be struck by lightning and killed by your TV set or your couch than to be killed by a Muslim extremist or terrorist. But is that how our politicians talk about it? Some of them. They make it to you as if it's the biggest threat facing our society. But Americans really don't know these facts. Ask a random American tomorrow if you see. How many people do you think have been killed? They really think it's in the thousands, hundreds of thousands. They have no clue. We need to share these statistics. In 2015, there were 355 mass shootings in the US. 355 mass shootings. And yes, one of them was an extremist. You know, that terrorist Farouk, the one who was responsible for the San Bernardino attacks. But what does Trump do? He takes this one particular shooting and he makes it the biggest threat facing America. If you look at Europe, because Europe saw a wave of attacks as well. The last several years, if you look at Europe, the last 10 years or so, the last 15 years or so, out of all acts of terrorism committed in Europe, 2% of them was what? By Muslims. Even less than their population. Because if you examine the population of Muslims in Europe, in some countries it's 5%, in some 10%, in some 15%. But only 2% of all terrorist acts were committed by Muslims in Europe. Is this really the biggest threat? But many people don't know that. We have to share these statistics with our society to calm them down a bit. Yes, terrorism is a big issue. We have to solve terrorism. We have to denounce terrorism. But don't let that fear make you irrational. Don't make that fear make you a racist person. So the results have been very damaging. The results of such poisonous rhetoric, the consequences of such hateful rhetoric has been very, very damaging. You know, there was a blog, a hate blog, for people who wanted to express their hate. It had 11,000 members. After the rhetoric of Trump, you know how many members now it has? 11 million. 11 million people now are subscribed to this hate blog. What does that tell you? This is very dangerous. And to show you about the religion of Islam specifically, what's happening in this country, according to some surveys that were done recently, the religion of Islam is seen as the most unfavorable religion in this country, behind atheism. Can you imagine that? In June, this past June, just 2-3 months ago, nearly half of Americans supported Donald Trump's proposal to ban all Muslims. Nearly half of Americans actually supported that ban. Nearly 50% of Americans, they admit that they feel prejudice towards Muslims and Islam. 25% of Americans agreed that Muslims should carry a special ID card in order to prevent further attacks in the future. And this is extremely alarming. Half of all Republicans believe that Islam is a violent religion. It's a religion that condones violence, encourages violence. This is very alarming to us, respected brothers and sisters. But I'm not here to scare you. What is the solution of the religion of Islam?